lost just looking at how they make profit out of countries crashing and companies losing everything. They make profit of it. People losing, and we can't wrap our heads around that kind of stuff because we were taught to think in a linear fashion, whereas these guys don't think in a linear fashion at all. They're natural, in a sense, they're naturally wild. Interesting term, wild, because that's a term that Charles Galton Darwin talked about when he said we'll have to alter all the people by putting hormones in their food, etc., and literally engineering them. But we ourselves, being the elites, must not do it to ourselves. We must retain our wildness, be the ones until the dead to reach agreement on cutting 1.2 trillion to 1.5 trillion from the federal deficit over the next 10 years. The Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction still has no agreement to stem automatic cuts to the budget. How can they when they've got ongoing wars? And they talk on about how it used to be. It says the deficit has ballooned to nearly $48,000 for every man in trial in the US this year alone. Now, by the way, when you think about that, you see if you had a Visa card or a credit card, they put that their own guys in governments, and they're not about to sink themselves. And that's so much power to give up. Heady stuff power, isn't it? Very heady stuff. Now, as we go into the open because you're really a research patient. You're not a human being anymore. You're a commodity. You're a research patient. This is what they're and so they use balance the cost of life against the economic system. We can do wars and stuff because that brings in profit, you see, for the big boys who own your country, and you can plunder everything from them. And this is one of Britain's largest lobbying companies has been secretly recorded boasting about its access to the heart of the government and how it uses the dark arts to bury bad coverage and influence public opinion. Well, there's nothing new in this, but they've always done this. An undercover investigation by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, published in Independent Today, has taped senior executives at Bell Pottinger, one of these, claiming they have used their access to Downing Street, that's the British government hall, where the Prime Minister sits, to get David Cameron to speak to the Chinese Premier on behalf of one of their business clients within 24 hours of asking him to do so. Actually, they got him to do it. Posting about Bell Pottinger's access to the Foreign Secretary, William Hague, Mr. Cameron's Chief of Staff, Ed Llewellyn, and Mr. Cameron's old friend and closest number 10 advisor, Steve Hamilton, suggesting that the company could manipulate Google results to drown out negative coverage of human rights violations and child labour. Revealing that Bell Pottinger is a team which sorts negative Wikipedia coverage of clients. Seeing it was possible to use the Member of Parliaments known to be critical of investigative programmes to attack their reporting for minor errors. Well, the same thing we saw too with the whole Murdoch scam. They went into the same thing because after all media and a way of covering and burying and telling you what they want you to think and believe. Always done this. Now, reports from the Bureau pose as agents from the government of Uzbekistan, a brutal dictatorship responsible for killings, human rights violations, and child labour, and representatives of its cotton industry in a bid to discover what promises British lobbying and public relations firms were prepared to make when pitching clients, and what techniques they use, and how much of their work is subject to public scrutiny. Remember, Fergie was doing that too, and the Duchess, because her man at the time was in charge of all basically UK relations abroad for big contracts, big government contracts, and she was taking £500,000 a time for it. She boasted about it when she was drunk, remember. In Uzbekistan, child labour is used in cotton fields and so on and so on. And it says, I've been working with Hilton, Cameron and Osborne for 20 years. The Bureau contacted 10 London firms, 2 refused to take the business, several others did not reply, while 5, including Bell Pottinger, appeared to be keen to work with fictitious Uzbek representatives. Bell Pottinger quoted £1 million plus as a fee for carrying out the work. So money talks, isn't it? Money walks. Their claims, which were secretly recorded, will add to mounting concerns that an absence of regulation has made London a global centre for reputation laundering, where lobbyists work behind the scenes on behalf of the world's most controversial regimes. As far more open in the US. It really is. It's very open in the US. Who's lobbying, who gets all the contracts and even gets to use the US military for its own agendas and things. It's rather open there. But in Britain, of course, they still try to keep up this stiff upper lip with all goody two-shoes, because we all come from Eton and Oxford and Cambridge. But in reality, they're all as corrupt as can be, because the society and the generation that grew up now with this in there is utterly corrupt. That's why. David Cameron pledged to tackle lobbying 5 years ago, and then again last year, saying it was the next big scandal waiting to happen, and has tainted our politics for too long. And then, of course, he got wrapped into the Murdoch stuff where Murdoch was flying him and all the other previous prime ministers all over the planet in his private jet. Well, the bottom line is lobbying is their form of democracy. We don't really count. Our job is just to get somebody in, and then the lobbyists take over. Through Article 2 on, it's called SWAT raids, stun guns and pepper spray, why the government is ramping up the use of force. And it goes into all the scenarios and the reasons they've given for it. This is in February last year. A video surfaced of a marijuana raid in Columbia, Minnesota, during the raid on Jonathan Whitworth and his family. Police took down the door with a battering ram, then within seconds shot and killed one of Whitworth's dogs and wounded the other. They always go and kill your animals first, that's to get you really raised so they can kill you. They didn't find enough pot in the house to charge Whitworth with, even with a misdemeanor. He was, however, charged with misdemeanor possession of drug paraphernalia when police found a pipe. The disturbing video went viral in May 2010, triggering an outrage around the world. On Fox News, conservative columnists Charles Krauthammer and Billy O'Reilly cautioned not to judge the entire drug war by the video, which they characterised as an isolated incident, which of course it isn't. So in fact, very little about the raid was isolated or unusual. For the most part, it was carried out the same way as drug warrants are served some 150 times per day in the US. The battering ram, the execution of the dog, the fact that the police weren't aware Whitworth's 7-year-old child was in the home before they riddled the place with bullets, the fact that they found only a small amount of pot likely for personal use, all are common in drug raids. The only public debate over the now infamous pepper spraying of Occupy protesters at University of California, Davis protest earlier this month. This was just one of a number of high-profile uses of force amid crackdowns on Occupy protesters across the country, and they go on to name some of them. But then it goes into what's happened over the last 30 years, and I'll touch on that as we come back from this break.
You're listening to the Republic Broadcasting Network, because you can handle the truth.
Hi folks, I'm Alan Water, back cutting through the matrix and going over some of the history years that led up to the present system now of just battering down doors and firing off the guns, because all these guys too, remember, who dressed in the fancy outfits have been dreaming all their lives as they played all these video games to actually live the real role, and here they are, they can go and shoot people up and stuff. And I'm not kidding you, that's why they created this generation to do so, because this is an authoritarian system you're into now. It's not democratic at all. It's authoritarianism. I mentioned that last night, that the Club of Rome said back in the 70s it have to go into a post-democratic system, it would have to be authoritarian in nature. So anyway, this is outraged by Occupy crackdown. Some pundits and political commentators who have looked to these issues in the past are now calling for a national discussion on the use of force. It's a welcome development, but it's helpful to review how we got here in order to have an honest to be attributed to the broader toughen crime and drug war policies pushed by politicians of both parties since at least the early 1980s, but part of the